Hi, I'm Dave Ganskopp of the Eastern Oregon Ag Research Center with an Eastern Oregon Ag Minute. Over the last few summers, we've been using cattle equipped with GPS collars to help us learn more about how landscape characteristics and management programs affect livestock distribution on rangelands. These GPS collars are superb tools for these studies for several reasons. First, they're remarkably accurate with the ability to determine a cow's location within about 2 to 4 yards of the animal's true position. Second, the collars can be programmed to record positions from once per day up to 144 locations per day, or once every 5 minutes. Unlike people, they willingly work 24 hours a day, rain or shine, and never take a day off. Lastly, the collars are equipped with motion sensors that can tell us whether cattle are grazing, walking, or resting at each location. In the coming days, we'll discuss some of our findings from these instruments and how they may apply to livestock management of our rangeland pastures. For the next couple sessions, we'll discuss some recent studies at the station where we use GPS collars to track cattle movements on rangelands. For a couple of years now, we have fall burned areas in our pastures that cattle have historically ignored. In each instance, when the cattle came back the next spring, they grazed almost exclusively in the burned areas. This has been a classic example of what managers should not do because the recovering vegetation supported almost the full grazing load for the entire pasture. In our first experiment, we only burned about 4 or 5% of the pasture, and that limited area supported about 45% of the spring cattle grazing activities. Because the cattle continued to revisit the burn and to graze and regraze their favorite grasses, we could weaken those grasses to such a degree that cheatgrass could invade the site. That is not a desirable event at all because cheatgrass exhibits radical fluctuations in annual yields and can bring about a higher frequency of wildfires. For the next couple sessions, we're discussing some recent studies at the station where we use GPS collars to track cattle movements on rangelands. Yesterday we mentioned that cattle tend to camp out on recently burned sites in the spring months and potentially overgraze recovering grasses. We have also brought GPS-collared cattle into partially burned pastures well after the growing season is over and all grasses are cured and dormant. At that time, even the grasses in burn sites are dry and forage quality is low across the entire pasture. Our preliminary findings suggest cattle no longer focus on burned areas then, and there is little danger of imposing any physiological stress on grasses by removing cured herbage. This implies that it may not be necessary to rest a pasture for 2 full years after a burn. If we at least give the grasses a rest during the growing season, they should be fine. When there are desirable shrubs like bitterbrush in the burned areas, however, cattle may focus on the still green, recovering bushes in the late season and reduce their stature. Recently, we've discussed some studies where we use GPS collars to track cattle movements in some partially burned rangeland pastures. If cattle come back to those pastures as soon as grasses start to grow, they will focus solely on the burned zones. Yesterday we mentioned that if we can delay stocking a partially burned pasture until grasses have cured, that cattle will not focus on the burned sites and will spread more evenly across the pastures. 2 important lessons came out of these studies. First is that if we expect to apply some prescribed fires in a pasture, we should burn as much of that landscape as possible. This avoids focusing stock on a limited area in subsequent years if we have to stock during the growing season. Second, if we can hold off grazing a recently burned pasture until the grasses have cured, cattle will likely not focus on the treated areas. This would give recovering herbage a full growing season to reestablish itself and recover with little harm incurred from late use of dormant herbage. Today we're discussing another study where we use GPS collars to track cattle movements on rangelands. The study was recently completed up in Oregon's Hells Canyon country, comparing rugged pasture use by Corriente longhorn cattle and Hereford Angus pairs. Hopes were that the lighter-framed Spanish cattle would make more uniform use of the steep slopes than British breeds. In a nutshell, the study didn't shake anything out. Both breeds traveled about the same distance, moved the same distances out from water, and used the same degrees of slope. About the only difference exhibited between the two breeds was that the Hereford Angus cattle came into water once each day, and the Spanish cattle watered once every 2 days. If one was hauling water out to cattle, this could be an important management consideration, but if one is looking for animals that will range further out in rugged country, there seem to be no significant differences between the two breeds. I'm Dave Ganskopp. Be careful out there, and we'll see you again.